The emergency room doors exploded open at Iowa Methodist Medical Center on a Tuesday evening in February 1987. Paramedics rushed through carrying a 2-year-old boy who was convulsing, struggling to breathe, his small body fighting for life itself. His mother ran beside the gurney, her face showing all the right expressions of fear and concern. She knew exactly when to look panicked, exactly when to choke back tears, exactly what to say to make everyone believe she was a desperate mother watching her child slip away. But what the doctors didn't know, what nobody knew yet, was that this same woman had been playing this exact scene over and over again. And she was getting better at it every single time. She'd rehearsed this performance in multiple states, across dozens of emergency rooms, with 2 different children. Each time perfecting her act, each time learning how to play the role of the devoted mother just a little bit better. The Reed family had just moved to Urbandale, Iowa, only days before this latest emergency. It was their 4th move in 3 years. Ray Reed's job with Swift Independent Meatpacking kept transferring him to new locations, and his wife Tanya had become an expert at starting fresh in new towns. New doctors who didn't know their history, new hospitals where nobody had seen the pattern yet, new communities where she could rebuild her image as the perfect mother facing impossible medical challenges. This is the story of Tanya Reed, a case so disturbing that it would change how we prosecute child abuse forever. Because sometimes the person hurting a child isn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. Sometimes it's the one person who should be protecting them most. Sometimes it's the person standing by the hospital bed, holding their hand, pretending to pray for their recovery. When little Michael Reed arrived at the hospital that February night, the attending physician did what doctors always do. He pulled up the boy's medical history, and what he found made his stomach drop. Page after page of emergency room visits, unexplained seizures, breathing episodes that stopped as mysteriously as they started, neurological symptoms that made no sense. Michael was 2 years old, and his medical file looked like it belonged to someone who'd lived a lifetime of illness. The sheer volume of medical documentation for such a young child was staggering. Doctors in 3 different states had run every test imaginable. EEGs to check for epilepsy, MRIs to look for brain abnormalities, sleep studies to monitor his breathing, genetic testing to rule out hereditary conditions, blood work to check for metabolic disorders. Every test came back normal, or at least they came back normal when the doctors were watching. The symptoms only appeared at home, only when Tanya was the sole caregiver. And that's what made this a medical mystery that nobody could solve. Because they were looking for a disease when they should have been looking at the person reporting the symptoms. But here's where it gets strange. Every single one of these episodes, and I mean every single one, happened when Michael was alone with his mother. Not when he was at daycare, not when babysitters were watching him, not when his father was home, only when Tanya Reed was the only adult in the room. The daycare workers had never seen Michael have a single seizure, not one breathing episode. He was just a normal, happy toddler when he was with them. But the moment Tanya picked him up, within hours, sometimes within minutes, he'd be back in the emergency room fighting for his life. Think about that for a second. Paramedic Tony Collins had been responding to calls at the Reed household for months now, and he started noticing something that made him uncomfortable. He kept a logbook of every emergency call, like most paramedics do, and when he went back through it, he saw a pattern that made his blood run cold. The calls came on Tuesdays and Fridays, always late afternoon or early evening. Always when Ray Reed was at work, always when Tanya was alone with her son. But that's not even the most disturbing part. Tony noticed that Tanya was always incredibly calm when he arrived. Most parents in a genuine medical emergency are panicked, barely coherent, desperate. But Tanya was composed. She knew exactly what to tell him. She had Michael's symptoms memorized like lines from a script. She knew medical terminology that most lay people wouldn't know. And she always seemed almost disappointed when Michael would stabilize before they reached the hospital. Looking back, Tony realized he'd seen the signs all along. He just hadn't known what he was looking at. You see, what none of the doctors in Iowa knew was that Michael Reed wasn't Tanya's first sick child. 3 years earlier, in a small town in Texas, the Reeds had another baby. Her name was Morgan, and she was 9 months old when she lost her life. The official cause? Cardiorespiratory arrest of unknown origin. Basically, doctors had no idea why this baby had stopped breathing and never started again. It was classified as one of those tragic mysteries that sometimes happen with infants. But Morgan's short life had been filled with the exact same pattern as Michael's. Countless hospitalizations, mysterious breathing problems, seizures that made no sense. And every single time, it was Tanya Reed who called 911. Every single time, it was Tanya who performed CPR. Every single time, she managed to revive her child just before the paramedics arrived. To everyone who knew her, Tanya was a hero. A devoted mother fighting desperately to save her children from some terrible, unidentifiable medical condition. People in her community talked about how calm she stayed during emergencies, how well she knew CPR, how she never seemed to panic. They thought these were signs of strength. They had no idea they were actually watching someone who'd practiced this performance over and over again. February 7th started like any other Sunday for Ray Reed. He was downstairs, probably reading the paper or watching television, when he heard his wife scream. Not the kind of scream you hear in horror movies. This was the practiced scream of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Ray ran upstairs and found Tanya performing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on their son. Michael had stopped breathing again. They rushed to the hospital, just like they'd done so many times before. But this time, a nurse noticed something. Something that would crack this entire case wide open. There were red parallel scratch marks across Michael's cheek. Not random scratches. These were perfectly parallel lines, the kind you'd see if tiny fingers were desperately trying to push something away from their face. The kind of marks a toddler might make if someone was covering their nose and mouth, and they were fighting for air. Here's where it gets even more chilling. A few minutes after noticing these scratches on Michael, that same nurse watched Tanya approach her. Tanya held up her hand, showed the nurse a bleeding finger, and casually asked for a bandage. She mentioned the scratch almost proudly, like it was just another detail in her stressful day. Think about what that means. Your 2-year-old son is fighting for his life in the emergency room, and you're worried about a scratch on your finger? What kind of mother does that? The answer: not a real mother. An actress playing the role of a mother. When the hospital staff brought their concerns to Dr. Bennett, Iowa's medical examiner, he knew exactly what he was looking at. He'd seen cases like this before, though they were rare. So rare that most people refused to believe they existed. He introduced the investigation team to a concept called Munchausen syndrome by proxy. It's named after an 18th century baron who was famous for making up elaborate stories about his war experiences. But this syndrome is far darker than just telling tall tales. Munchausen syndrome by proxy is when a caregiver, usually a mother, deliberately harms their child to gain attention, sympathy, and the devoted care of medical professionals. It's a form of abuse so twisted, so unthinkable, that even when doctors suspect it, they hesitate to say it out loud. Because who wants to believe that a mother would hurt her own child just to feel important? But the profile fit Tanya Reid like a glove. She had medical knowledge from her nursing background, which meant she knew exactly how to create symptoms that would alarm doctors but not immediately result in her child's passing. She knew how long she could cut off a child's air supply before causing permanent damage. She knew which symptoms would get the most dramatic response from emergency personnel. She was isolated in her marriage, with a husband who traveled constantly for work. Ray Reid was focused on climbing the corporate ladder, moving from city to city, working long hours. He left Tanya alone with the children for extended periods. And in that isolation, she found her purpose in the medical crises she created. She seemed to crave the attention and admiration she received during each medical emergency. Hospital staff would talk about what a strong mother she was. Neighbors would bring casseroles and offer support. People would stop her in the grocery store to ask how Michael was doing. She was the center of attention, the brave mother facing an impossible challenge. And most damning of all, nobody had ever witnessed the start of Michael's episodes except her. Not his father, not daycare workers, not babysitters. Not a single independent witness had ever seen Michael's symptoms begin. They'd only seen Tanya's heroic attempts to save him. The medical community was starting to recognize this syndrome more in the late 1980s, but it was still controversial. Many doctors didn't want to believe that a mother could do this. They'd rather believe in a rare, undiagnosable medical condition than face the reality that a parent was deliberately harming their child. But the evidence in Tanya's case was becoming impossible to ignore. Armed with this theory, investigators made a call to Texas. They needed to know more about Morgan Reid's supposed SIDS case. What they discovered would turn a child endangerment case into something much worse. The Texas autopsy report hadn't said SIDS at all. Buried in the medical terminology were three crucial words: acute subdural hematoma. That's bleeding around the brain. The report described two distinct blood clots around Morgan's skull, described as recent clotted blood with no evidence of healing. There was also something else the pathologist had noted: retinal hemorrhages. That's bleeding in the back of the eyes. Dr. Bennett recognized these signs immediately. They were the textbook markers of shaken baby syndrome. Morgan Reid hadn't lost her life from mysterious natural causes. She'd been violently shaken, hard enough to cause fatal brain injuries. But here's what makes this even more significant from a forensic perspective. The combination of subdural hematoma and retinal hemorrhages is extremely specific. You don't get that combination from a child falling or from SIDS. You get it from violent acceleration-deceleration trauma. What happens when an infant's head is snapped back and forth rapidly? The brain literally bounces inside the skull, tearing blood vessels and causing the distinctive pattern of injuries the pathologist had documented. The original Texas pathologist in 1984 had noted these findings, but hadn't made the connection to abuse. SIDS was the easy answer, the answer that didn't require pointing fingers at a grieving mother. But now, with Michael's case bringing new scrutiny, those autopsy findings took on a completely different meaning. And here's the thing that makes this even more horrifying. The investigators discovered that Morgan had been hospitalized 20 times before her passing. 20 times. Emergency rooms in Texas had seen this baby over and over again, always with Tanya performing CPR, always barely saving her daughter's life in the nick of time. Medical records showed that in the months before Morgan's passing, the episodes were escalating. They were becoming more frequent, more severe. It was like Tanya was building up to something, pushing further each time, seeing how far she could go. And before those 20 hospitalizations, Tanya had heroically saved her with CPR on dozens of other occasions that never made it to the hospital. Times when she'd revived Morgan just before calling 911. Times when she was the only witness to her daughter's brush with the end. Michael had been hospitalized 18 times across 3 different states. 18 times he'd been rushed to emergency rooms in Illinois, Texas, and now Iowa. 18 times Tanya had been the only witness to whatever caused his medical crisis. 18 times she'd performed CPR and revived him just before paramedics arrived. The pattern was undeniable now. The geographic spread across multiple states had actually helped hide what was happening. No single hospital or doctor saw the full picture. But when investigators compiled all the records into one timeline, the pattern became crystal clear. This wasn't a mother trying to save her children. This was a mother slowly ending her children's lives while playing the role of their savior. And she'd been doing it for years, across state lines, with nobody catching on until now. Investigators knew they needed to act fast, but they also knew they needed proof. So they did something that would either confirm their worst fears or prove Tanya Reid innocent. They removed Michael Vahsib from his mother's care. They placed him in foster care in a controlled environment where Tanya had no access to her son whatsoever. Then they waited to see what would happen. What happened was nothing. Absolutely nothing. For 2 months, Michael experienced 0 seizures, no breathing problems, no medical emergencies of any kind. The sick little boy who had been dying slowly in his mother's care suddenly became completely, perfectly healthy. He was a normal toddler, playing, laughing, thriving. That's when investigators discovered something that made this case even more disturbing. In 1974, when Tanya was just 15 years old, she'd been babysitting when a child in her care stopped breathing. She'd called paramedics and saved the child's life. The town gave her their Good Neighbor Award. She was a teenage hero. But what investigators now realized was that this was the first time. The first time Tanya had discovered the rush of being the savior. The first time she'd felt what it was like to be the center of attention, to have people praising her courage, to be seen as heroic. And she'd been chasing that feeling ever since. When Tanya Reid finally stood trial, she looked exactly like what she'd spent years pretending to be. A perfect suburban mother, well-dressed, articulate, devastated by the accusations against her. She even passed a lie detector test when asked if she'd ever harmed her children. But prosecutor Melody Haynes wasn't buying it. She'd seen the pattern. She'd seen the evidence. She'd seen how Michael thrived the moment he was removed from his mother's care. Haynes methodically presented the timeline of hospitalizations, the pattern of emergency calls, and the damning evidence of Michael's perfect health in foster care. She explained to the jury how Munchausen syndrome by proxy works, how perpetrators become addicted to the drama, to the attention, to the sense of importance that comes from being at the center of medical crises. But the most dramatic moment came when Haynes asked Tanya about other children. Had she ever been responsible for another child who had breathing difficulties? Tanya looked directly at the jury and said no. She'd never cared for another child with similar problems. It was a lie. A completely unnecessary lie. And it destroyed her, because Haynes had evidence of the 1974 incident. She had the newspaper clippings about the Good Neighbor Award. She had documentation showing that, yes, another child had stopped breathing in Tanya's care when she was 15 years old. The defense attorney's face went pale as he realized his client had just destroyed her own credibility with a single, pointless lie. On April 28, 1989, the jury found Tanya Thaxton Reid guilty of felony child endangerment. She received a 10-year prison sentence in Iowa. But her legal troubles weren't over. Not even close. Texas prosecutors had been watching the Iowa trial carefully. They now had new evidence about Morgan's true cause of passing. They indicted Tanya for ending her infant daughter's life. In 1993, a second jury convicted her. This time, she received 40 years in prison. The Texas trial revealed even more disturbing details about what investigators believed happened. They theorized that Tanya's method had evolved over time. What started as controlled suffocation to create medical emergencies had escalated with Morgan. They believed that in a desperate attempt to revive her daughter after going too far, Tanya had violently shaken the infant, causing the fatal brain injuries that ended her life. Throughout both trials, and even to this day, Tanya maintains her innocence with unwavering conviction. She insists she's the victim of a medical mystery that doctors simply couldn't understand. She positions herself as a devoted mother who fought desperately to save her children from a genetic condition that took one child's life and nearly took another's. Even when prosecutors offered her plea bargains that would have significantly reduced her prison time in exchange for confession, she refused. She chose decades in prison over admitting what she'd done. Ray Reed divorced Tanya after her conviction. He remarried and gained full custody of Michael and Carolyn, keeping them far away from the woman who had nearly ended one of their lives. And here's the remarkable thing. Michael grew up completely healthy. No more seizures. No more breathing problems. No more mysterious medical emergencies. All of those life-threatening conditions that had plagued him for the first 2 years of his life simply vanished the moment his mother could no longer access him. Think about what that means. Think about the implications of a child's medical condition completely disappearing the instant one specific person can't be alone with them. Carolyn was 6 years old when her mother was arrested. Old enough to remember. Old enough to have watched her mother save her brother over and over again. Old enough to have possibly witnessed things she couldn't quite understand at the time. Both children grew up with their father and stepmother, building new lives far from the nightmare of their early years. They've stayed out of the public eye, understandably wanting nothing to do with the notoriety of their mother's case. This is where the story gets complicated. According to Texas Department of Criminal Justice records, Tanya Reed served her Iowa sentence and then her Texas sentence. She was reportedly released from prison in 2008 after serving approximately 15 years combined time. Multiple sources from 2014 indicated she was living in Amarillo, Texas, the same city where Morgan lost her life, and working at a McDonald's. Some reports suggested she was living with family members. But here's where things get murky. Several unverified sources from 2020 to 2023 claim that Tanya Reed passed away in August 2020. However, there's no official death certificate or obituary from a credible source to confirm this. What makes this concerning is that one source from 2023 claimed she had a grandson who reportedly passed away at 6 months old due to complications at birth. If true, this would be deeply troubling given her history. However, this information lacks verification. As of 2024 to 2025, Tanya Reed's current whereabouts remain unclear. She would be approximately 67 years old if still living. What we do know, Michael Reed is alive and healthy today, living a normal life. The mysterious medical condition that nearly took his life has never returned. Not once in over 35 years since he was removed from his mother's care. That fact speaks louder than any words ever could. The Tanya Reed case broke new ground in child abuse prosecution. It was one of the first times Munchausen syndrome by proxy was successfully used in a criminal trial, establishing legal precedents that helped convict other perpetrators across the United States. Before this case, many doctors hesitated to report suspected cases of medical child abuse. The idea that a mother would deliberately harm her child for attention seemed unbelievable. But the Reed case proved it was real. It showed investigators and prosecutors how to recognize the pattern. Repeated hospitalizations with no clear diagnosis, symptoms that only occur when one caregiver is present. A caregiver with medical knowledge who seems unusually calm during emergencies, and a child whose health dramatically improves when separated from that caregiver. Today, hospitals have protocols for identifying medical child abuse. Social workers and doctors are trained to spot warning signs, and prosecutors have a roadmap for building cases, thanks to precedents set by cases like Tanya Reed's. Here's what makes the Tanya Reed case so disturbing. The layers of deception were so complete that she almost got away with it. She'd successfully presented herself as a devoted mother for years. She'd convinced doctors, nurses, paramedics, neighbors, and even her own husband that she was a hero fighting to save her children from a mysterious illness. She'd received sympathy, attention, and admiration for her supposed strength during medical crises. And all the while, she was the one creating those crises. She'd discovered, probably by accident when she was just 15 years old babysitting, that there was power in being the person who saved someone's life. There was attention. There was praise. There was a rush of importance that she couldn't get anywhere else in her life. And she became addicted to it. Morgan Reed paid for that addiction with her life. She was 9 months old when her mother's need for attention escalated to a point of no return. The violent shaking that ended her life might have been an accident, a panicked attempt to revive a baby after suffocating her too long. Or it might have been the next step in an escalating pattern. We'll never know for sure. Michael Reed came terrifyingly close to following his sister. 18 hospitalizations across 3 states, dozens of episodes where he stopped breathing. 2 years of his young life spent being slowly ended by the one person who was supposed to protect him. He survived only because one nurse noticed scratch marks on his cheek and had the courage to ask hard questions. Think about how close this came to being filed away as another tragic SIDS case. Think about how many people saw the pattern but didn't want to believe what it meant. Think about how Tanya Reed almost got away with ending one child's life and nearly taking another's. The most haunting aspect isn't just that a mother harmed her children. It's that she spent years convincing everyone, including potentially herself, that she was trying to save them. It's that she played 2 roles simultaneously: villain and hero, perpetrator and savior. And she was good at it. So good that even after 2 convictions, even after Michael's dramatic recovery, the moment he was removed from her care, even after all the evidence was laid bare in 2 trials, she maintains her innocence to this day. The case serves as a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind the face of a worried mother. Tanya Reed's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth: that human psychology can be so twisted that someone can hurt the people they're meant to protect and genuinely believe they're the victim. 2 children walked into Tanya Reed's life. One never walked out. The other barely escaped. And somewhere, whether she's living quietly in Texas or whether she's passed away, as some sources claim, Tanya Reed still insists she did nothing wrong. Still claims she was just a devoted mother trying to save her children from a condition nobody could diagnose. But we know the truth now. We know what those scratch marks on Michael's face meant. We know why Morgan's brain showed signs of violent trauma. We know why Michael's health problems vanished the moment his mother couldn't be alone with him. The medical mystery was never about the children. It was always about the mother who needed them to be sick so she could feel important saving them. That's the story of Tanya Reed. That's the case that changed how we prosecute medical child abuse. That's the nightmare that proved some mother's love isn't love at all. It's something far darker and more dangerous than most people want to believe possible. And that's why, decades later, this case still haunts everyone who studies it. Because it forces us to ask, how many other cases like this have we missed? How many other children are out there right now, being slowly harmed by the person who's supposed to protect them, while that person receives praise for being devoted? The Tanya Reid case taught us to ask those hard questions. It taught us to look past the surface, past the tears and apparent devotion, and see the patterns that tell the real story. Sometimes the person fighting hardest to save a child is actually the reason that child needs saving in the first place. Remember that, because Michael Reed's life depended on people remembering it. And somewhere out there, another child's life might depend on it too.